Welcome to the Fall of Civilization. I'm your host, James Gilbert. This is American Contrarian. And today, we're going to do things differently because I don't know how the fuck I'm doing things yet. Today, we're going to talk about Alex Friedman having Dr. Carl Hart, the author of Drug Use for Grown-Ups, on his podcast on Saturday. That's the first thing we're going to talk about. Now, Alex Friedman had Dr. Carl Hart on to discuss drug use and addiction. Dr. Hart is a neuroscientist working at Columbia University and has become a cultural leader on this subject from being featured on Joe Rogan and the mainstream media. In his newest book, he explains his own use of just about every drug that people use. And he explains he believes they can all be used safely and admits that he's become a heroin user while researching this book. He speaks very highly of heroin and MDMA. Dr. Hart has translated a lot of the woke propaganda into his view of drugs. Just as liberal universities argue all cultures are equal and claiming one is better than another is racist, he argues that all drugs are equal, and claiming one is better than another is racist. Dr. Hart's views on this topic are distorted by his inability to admit his own addiction to heroin. He staked his reputation on this claim that all drugs are essentially harmless under the proper conditions, and all regulations around them are based entirely on profits, propaganda, and prejudice. Now, he's mostly right. The just say no style policies of the last century and the propaganda of the idea that all drugs will inevitably destroy lives, making the safest action to ban them entirely, thereby putting the business in the hands of criminals, has been incredibly destructive to society as a whole, and is one of the greatest sources of distrust between the public and the government to this day. These policies do need to be changed. But where the government oversimplified all drugs as equally bad, Dr. Hart oversimplifies them as all equally good. At one point, Lex asks Hart what the most important thing he's learned in his life is. Dr. Hart claims it is self-sufficiency. Hart, you and I both know you can't be self-sufficient when you're going through heroin withdrawals. The fact that you still use heroin daily is proof of how difficult it is to stop. Anyone that uses heroin consecutively for 3 days will have withdrawals when they stop. Use for 3 weeks, you're an addict. After 3 months, your brain is forever rewired, and most people who have ever maintained a habit this long will die on an opiate. Now, to clarify, I'm saying you use it every single day for all that time. There are plenty of people who have gotten high once or twice and not had a problem. But for those of us who have maintained a habit, we're never going to be the same. I know because I'm one of them, and it's my greatest regret. We do not live in a world of proper conditions. The conditions of the world today include failing communities, broken families, shortening lifespans, overcrowded yet isolating cities with dwindling opportunities. In other words, we live in a society in decline. The temporary release which opiates offer is too seductive for a defeated population to deny, and our enemies are well aware of that. The Chinese Empire of the late Industrial Revolution was much like America is today. The main religion of the state, Confucianism, was dying. They'd gone from being a production-based society to a consumption-based one. The standard of living had been declining generation by generation, keeping pace with their overall standing in the world. For the first time, European empires surpassed China technologically, economically, and as made evident by the Opium Wars, militarily. In case you don't know, The Opium Wars were fought by the British, with the help of all the main Western powers, against the Chinese Empire because China tried to ban the sale of Indian opium within its empire on 2 occasions. On each of those occasions, Western militaries beat the empire into submission and forced them to legally accept and trade their opium. Britain began importing massive amounts of opium into China, selling it at prices even peasants could afford. This was far from the only item in which China very quickly went from being an exporter of the highest quality to importing cheap foreign alternatives. This destroyed the value of Chinese goods, crippling the Chinese economy, lowering living standards, and demoralizing the people. Demoralized people with nothing to do had an increased demand for opium. It was a catch-22. The emperor realized foreign traders had more control of his citizens than he did, and he enacted the first opium ban. It failed. Many within the empire had been bought by these foreign interests already, and eventually the Opium Wars caused the fall of the empire entirely. Do you hear any parallels? In this interview, Dr. Hart talks a lot about how the war on drugs gets funding from questionable sources. Well, I wonder how much money Dr. Hart and Columbia University have accepted from Chinese grants. I don't have time to look for evidence into that. I'm just a working stiff, but it's worth looking into if you do. Dr. Hart is more of a politician than a researcher today. As such, his opinions are far more entrenched than a researcher's would be. He's trying to affect public policy, so he can't admit that heroin use leads to addiction. And only a politician could deny such an obvious statement. That admission would discredit his woke argument in favor of heroin addiction, but lead him to a more accurate conclusion. Opiates are uniquely habit-forming, and a one-size-fits-all approach to ending prohibition is just as inappropriate as the one-size-fits-all approach to enacting it. His omission, or reluctance to acknowledge his own addiction, makes me question his motives. If we value consumption in and of itself above all things, Dr. Hart's reached the logical conclusion for us all: heroin and MDMA. If you, like me, would like to believe there could be something more to life than trying to feel good at every moment and consume things, maybe we should develop a more nuanced approach to our drug policy than all good or all bad. I agree with Dr. Hart that our current system is destructive and immoral. The genie is out of the bottle and it's not going back in, and we do need a way to deal with people already addicted besides putting them in a cell. But that doesn't mean we must permit everything people currently do within the limitations of this broken system. Fentanyl wouldn't be a thing if people could just still smoke opium that they grew themselves. Who the fuck would want to do fentanyl if you owned a house where you could grow things? Do you own a house? I don't think many of the people using fentanyl own a fucking thing. As much as Dr. Carl Hart would like us to believe that it's all, yeah, rich people use drugs too, but they use better ones. Enabling someone to use fentanyl on the sidewalk until they OD is slightly more destructive and immoral than enslaving someone for drug possession. Allowing that person to create new addicts in the next generation is unacceptable. We need to be honest that all drugs are not the same. That some drugs people can use recreationally, and that's that. Like cocaine, or even amphetamines, or marijuana, alcohol, all sorts of things, hallucinogens. But benzodiazepines, opiates, antidepressants, these things, I'm not saying they should be Schedule 1 drugs where all research into them is completely prohibited and that people can't make the decision to use them. But I would not want to live in a society where my children could buy heroin at the corner store without anything stopping them. Maybe just an age restriction. That's what this guy seems to think would be appropriate. I think that for some people, life might be hard enough that you need a fucking opiate. But if it is that point, go to a doctor. Tell him how fucking bad you feel, how nothing else is working. Because that should be a last resort. Because there's no coming back from it. And if we're going to have a nuanced approach to how we deal with drugs, then less people, not more, should be turning to opiates because they can find better alternatives that are not going to make them a lifelong slave. Because that's what opiates do. That's what benzos do. That's what antidepressants do. Once you start these things, it's so hard to stop. And for a lot of us, they might be necessary. I'm willing to admit that. But they should not be recreational. Let's admit what is recreation and what is a way to get by, a way to survive. If you're just using opiates for fun, you won't be for long. And I highly recommend you stop. Look at Dr. Carl Hart. He's a neuroscientist working at Columbia University, and he can't stop. If he can't stop, you think you can? Dr. Carl Hart, what you're doing is encouraging so many people to become heroin addicts, and I can't even understand that. Part of me thinks you're bullshitting, because I've never met a heroin addict who would do that willingly, and I've been one. In fact, Dr. Carl Hart, I call bullshit. I think you're a fucking faker. Come to Reno, because I can't afford to come to Columbia University, alright? I work at a factory. Come to Reno and let me snort some of your heroin with you, because I don't think it's even real heroin. I'm fine, I won't die. You say it's all fucking natural heroin or whatever, pure heroin, that's your selling point of why we should legalize it. And I agree on that point, that the users already using should have access to drugs that aren't contaminated. But do I want the next generation? How do you want the next generation to be dependent like you? That's insane. That's sociopathic. Alright, that's enough of that. Next up, New Zealand.
Different classes of people. If you're vaccinated or if you're unvaccinated, you have all these rights. If you are vaccinated...
That is what it is. So, yep. Yep.
Can you describe as you were previously hoping not to?
There it is. Two classes of citizens. If you're vaccinated, you have all these rights, and if you're unvaccinated, you don't. That's exactly where we're heading. And I'm scared, people. I don't know about you, but things aren't looking good. There was a vax mandate protest across the Brooklyn Bridge on Monday. I noticed that the news coverage offered no aerial shots of the protest or the march. Just marching shots. So you could only see the small group that was around the person filming. Wonder why. They had an aerial shot for that WNBA championship that no one showed up to. But they didn't have a helicopter there for this. Do you think that it might be because there's a financial incentive that the WNBA asking for a shitload of money was the incentive to show that they don't deserve it, and that bunch of people saying they don't want the vaccine means that nobody's going to get any money, so there's no incentive? I don't know. Yeah, I know. Alright, more importantly, Fauci tortures dogs. That's the story that everyone's paying attention to. And that is not the real story. But they're gonna put all the attention on that because they're throwing Fauci under the bus. He's no longer useful. Just like too many people were paying attention to how Andrew Cuomo murdered tens of thousands of elderly people by moving COVID patients into old folks' homes. He was no longer useful, but they can't admit that one of their people did that. So they throw him under the bus for grabbing some ass. With Fauci, well, yeah, he kind of created COVID-19 and is probably responsible for it getting out of the lab. So let's say he tortured dogs, which is something that anyone who knows anything, yeah, they torture all sorts of animals. They torture animals every single day. That's part of the system. Why did this particular instance come to light? Because people like dogs, and they need something to distract them from all the people he killed. That's why. This is how they save him while removing him from public scrutiny. That's all. That's it for today, folks. I wish you well during the apocalypse.